Hi, everyone. My name is Catherine Schmitt. I'm the Science Communications Specialist at Schoodic Institute. Welcome to what is the first of our noontime brown bag lunch discussions since we were all together in person in February. So glad that you could make it and bear with us as we adjust to this new mode of hosting talks. It's my great pleasure to introduce and welcome Ivan Fernandez, whom we're going to hear from today. I've worked with Ivan for over 10 years now on the Maine's Climate Future reports, the first one in 2009, and then subsequent updates in 2015 and 2020. Ivan is a distinguished professor at the University of Maine. He is a soil scientist by training, and his training was at the University of Maine, so he's also an alum. And he has a very long curriculum vitae and has long been at the University of Maine. He's in the School of Forest Resources and the Climate Change Institute and the School of Food and Agriculture, has served on multiple EPA scientific committees advising science policy concerning air quality, water quality, and soil quality, especially concerning acid rain and other air pollutants and how they affect forests and soils and waters of Maine. And lately, he's been serving on the Maine Climate Council. He's a member of the council. He's part of the Working Lands Working Group, and he is co-chair of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee, which has been working over the past year, been working hard over the past year to pull together the latest science on climate change in Maine and what the impacts are. And I think Ivan's going to share a little bit with us about that. And we'll take questions in the chat. There'll be time for questions at the end. So as they come up, or you can wait till the end, feel free to use the chat. You are on mute. We are recording this presentation. And any other questions, feel free to use the chat if you have technical issues. We should have about 15 minutes for questions at the end, and we'll try to wrap up as close to 1 o'clock as we can. So thanks a lot for being here, Ivan. I know it's a busy and a difficult time for a lot of people, so we really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and insight with us today.
You bet. Glad to be here. Actually, rather be there at Schoodic in the real world, as normally these kinds of talks and activities are. But we have to do what we have to do to sort of get through these times. I appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to talk with you a little bit today. Catherine had asked for me to talk a little bit about the Maine Climate Future reports and kind of the history of what they are and what they've shown and how they're kind of part of the landscape, if you would, of climate activity here in the state. So I'm going to give you a little history lesson, not the boring kind, but I think the good kind, because it leads to the present, and highlighting the Maine Climate Future reports that Catherine and I have worked together on, along with others over the probably closer to 15 years. As well as the work of the Maine Climate Council. This is a little, attractive gift to, at least attractive to me, that's borrowed from, and my slides, I guess, have their own timing today. Borrowed from a climate scientist at Hawkins, making the point that it's warming, and of course, that in fact is the simplest interpretation of the changes that are taking place, and obviously progressively changing over time. And we'll look at that a little bit more. Let's step back for a minute. What do we know about climate change? And what we know about climate change, as far as what we hear in the press and what we see often referred to in the political debates around policy mostly has come from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This little graphic is showing you the major releases of their climate assessments for the planet. IPCC stands for Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's through the UN. Hundreds of scientists from around the world that are nominated by their countries participate in the exercise. The first one was in 1990, and they're issued every 5 or 6 years, or have been issued every 5 or 6 years since then. It's worth noting that in 1990, we knew what was happening, what the cause was, and what we should do. We know a lot more now as our science develops and our understandings develop, but we still know what we need to do relative to addressing the climate challenge, and that first and foremost is getting off fossil fuels. And unfortunately, as probably we all know, we've not done very much of that at all. The most recent report was in 2013, 2014. And that's the data that we hear the most about relative to like the Paris Accord and what we hear referred to in the news. That's at the national level. I mean, at the international level, so the global level. At the national level, there's an interagency program in the US called the US Global Change Research Program. And it issues national assessments roughly every 4 years. The last one was in 2018. Lots of great information. Obviously, a lot of it paralleling what we see from IPCC at the global level. But one of the concerns long ago about these kinds of reports was that it made it difficult to use this information on a local level. And so it leaves us asking the question, what about Maine? And I put this slide together a long time or a while back now, grabbing images of, yeah, there's other states have, all states have agriculture, all states have wildlife, recreation, what have you. But on the other hand, we're all unique. And in order to make policy decisions and determine the most important adaptation strategies in a local context, we need local information. We want to know what's going on in our backyard, and for most average citizens, they've got a lot of things to worry about besides this sort of abstract concept of climate change, unless they see the connection to how it's directly influencing them. And so it was this interest in taking our information and knowledge about climate change to the local level that drew us to carry out an exercise of assessment at the level of the state of Maine that has proven to be relatively well received and important in the narrative about climate development here in Maine. In order to walk you through the history of climate activity here in Maine, from the political management side, I've got this one slide that is a short history of the timeline of climate activities that have taken place in Maine. And Maine has historically been a bit of a leader on climate change. In 1995, Maine was developed the first statewide greenhouse gas emissions inventory. This was just 5 years after the original 1990 report by IPCC, and there was a high level of interest in Maine to understand our level of contribution to the climate problem, as well as beginning to be concerned with its impacts on us. In 2000, the year 2000, the State Planning Office developed a draft to build or approach the establishment of a climate action plan. In 2001, then Governor King joined with other US governors from the northeastern states and the premiers from the eastern Canadian provinces, which is an organization for the region that actually has done a lot of good things by way of collaboration and coordination. And they agreed in 2001 to a set of regional greenhouse gas reduction goals. And so this was really the one of the earliest efforts to identify targets to move policy towards. In 2003, the Maine legislature enacted a law, first in the United States, to address climate change at the scale that it described, required Maine DEP to develop a climate action plan with the goal at the time to reduce emissions by 10% below the 1990 levels by 2020, by this year. And it used language at the time that said, in the long run, to reduce the threat of climate change. The good news is that we achieved those goals and then some. We exceeded those goals by the time we got to 2020. I think we're like 17% below. However, there were no real hard goals beyond 2020. Whoop, this timing thing's gonna, I apologize for that. I can't get inside it now to shut it off. There were no concrete goals after 2020, and none were developed essentially up until a year ago. In 2004, the Maine Climate Action Plan was finalized. It was the product of the exercise that started in 2000. It was to last from 2004 to 2012. It embodied these targets for greenhouse gas reductions. It focused only on mitigation. So this was a climate action plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the state of Maine. And again, we met our targets. No new efforts were established in 2012. The administration at the time simply said, keep doing what we're doing going forward. 2007, Maine became a charter member of a climate registry, which were a group of states that were banding together to coordinate on climate activity, climate programming. In 2008, Governor Baldacci asked the University of Maine to draft the initial assessment of climate-related changes in Maine. And so this is the beginning of essentially our Maine Climate Future reports and the impetus to provide information at the state level in order to support policy decision-making. That same year was pretty memorable because it was also the year that Maine joined the first regional greenhouse gas emissions auction, RGGI, which is this little symbol down here. RGGI was a cap and trade, or is a cap and trade program for the energy sector, which generated significant amounts of funds that have been very instrumental and continue to be to this day as far as investments in particularly conservation here in the state of Maine, energy conservation. In 2009, we issued this report, and so Maine's Climate Future, a preliminary assessment, was presented to the governor and legislature after a year of over 70 scientists coming together and giving of their time voluntarily. This was not a funded effort to evaluate the state of knowledge relative to climate change evidence and effects here in the state of Maine. And Catherine Schmitt and I and George Jacobson primarily sort of led that exercise, and many contributed to that process. The legislature really liked the report, found it quite valuable, and gave Maine's DEP the charge of developing an initial preliminary stakeholder adaptation report. At the time, remember, we had a climate action plan that focused on mitigation. This was now an effort to evaluate what we should be doing and planning for relative to adaptation, essentially how we respond to the reality of the changing climate. That was a year-long process. Maine DEP led it, and it resulted in a report called People and Nature Adapting to Climate Change, Charting Maine's Course. And this was a preliminary, since it was a one-year time frame only. They had to get back. I was part of the process as well, but it was led by Maine DEP. They had to get back to the legislature within 1 year with this preliminary report. And at the time, this is 2010, remember, the notion was that if it was well received, which it was, that we'd go forth and develop a climate action plan on the adaptation side. At the time, the thinking really was that when 2012 rolled around and the mitigation plan needed to be sort of reestablished, that it would be a combined integrated plan for adaptation as well as mitigation going forward beyond 2012. Politics changed in the state, and much of the climate momentum at the state level ceased in 2010. Of course, agencies were doing all the good work that they're doing, and we'll follow the history from there. In 2014, state government established a process of really evaluating what the different agencies were involved in doing that were important for climate change, both mitigation and adaptation. It was a really good report, identifying the good work going on in all of the state agencies. It was not a report focusing on a new emphasis on the climate challenge, but it did mark a bit of a turning point in looking at climate change under that administration. In 2015, we issued Maine's Climate Future, a 2015 update. This was a shorter report targeting some new insights and changes since the original 2009 report, and then pointing to additional examples of the emerging challenges that we see around us in Maine, or evidence of climate change impacts. Catherine Schmitt, myself, and particularly Sean Burkle, the state climatologist at the University of Maine, were key in moving that forward. That same year, an important effort here in Maine was a commission to study ocean and coastal acidification. And that's just a little clip off their report, but that was really the first state level initiative focused on new investments of time and energy to address one aspect of the climate challenge, and that was the ocean and coastal acidification. In 2016, the Environment and Energy Resources Working Group issued a report, and this working group eventually morphed into what is now and has been for a number of years the Maine Interagency Climate Adaptation Work Group, or MICA. And up until 2019, that has been the major or the primary coordination that was taking place within state government in Maine. Now, meanwhile, all sorts of things are happening throughout the state at various institutes and universities and communities, what have you. But we didn't have until most recently an effort to coordinate that at the state level. And the assessment reports that we were developing were often pointed to as evidence of the need for greater coordination. So that brings us up to the recent past. In 2019, in June, Governor Mills, now a new administration, signed into law, and we'll come back to this at the end of my comments here, but the Maine Climate Council, and it also established a directive to develop an integrated climate action plan, as well as setting new, very aggressive targets for greenhouse gas emissions reductions by 2030 and 2050. She's also signed us on to the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is about half of the states in the nation and more than half of the population. who essentially are not leaving the Paris Climate Accord relative to their activities and are moving forward with aggressive responses to climate change. And then finally, in just a month or so ago, or about 6 months ago, we released this report, which is the most recent update of Maine's climate future. A little bit more extensive, a lot more evidence unfolding in the intervening 5 years of the impacts on Maine, with some additional contexts and sort of educational information in that report. And then last month, the Science and Technical Committee of the Council released its work, which often cites the Maine Climate Future reports, but was a significant effort. It's about 370 pages in support of the council work, and we'll talk briefly about that again. So this is the history of Maine's activity, and Maine has really been a leader, and certainly now since the Climate Council and the Climate Action Plan is in place or being developed, it has taken its role once again in that cadre of states that are leading us forward on climate action. So what did we learn from this? I'm going to give you some of the highlights of the changing climate that we know about. I use this, call it my dashboard of some key indicators of a changing climate. Nothing here is going, I don't think, to surprise anyone. The middle column here is what's from the last 100 years, and this is either direct measurements, and so this is not speculative. We know this is what's happened. And then this column is the future, and these projections were only to 2050 with the notion that it is more relevant to the decisions we're making today than hearing about what might happen in 2100, which still feels like a long ways away. And what do we know? We know that, it's warming, no surprise. Over the last 100 years, it's warmed about 3 degrees centigrade, lots of interannual variation. So this is the long-term record of average annual temperatures. It's warmed about 3.2 degrees Fahrenheit. We expect another 1 to 3 degrees Fahrenheit by 2050. The warm season, growing season, frost-free season, however you want to refer to it, is getting longer by about 2 weeks, with another 2 weeks anticipated by 2050. Heat index days, it's a combination of temperature and humidity, and it's really targeting a human health aspect. We don't respond well to high heat index days. We have very few in Maine if we're vacation land. The ones we have tend to be along the coast, but we're going to see more, and certainly this past year we saw more. And the greatest increases in high heat index days will be along the coast. We're going to get more precipitation. We always knew we would, as from the scientific community. However, since the mid-2000s, we've seen dramatically greater precipitation. We'll look at another plot of that in a minute. It's increased about 15% over the last 100 years, another 5 or 10% anticipated by 2050. And this is occurring despite the fact that this year, of course, we're in a drought. And so overall, it will be a drier year in the long-term average. But for the non-dry parts of the year, we're still getting more precipitation. So total precipitation is increasing. We're getting less snow because it's getting warmer, and that's really not a surprise. About 7% less over the last century. Lots of different ways to measure snow. This is just one of them. And we see in this figure here that the anticipated loss of snow between now and 2050 is going to be greatest along the coast and the least in the interior and north. That's because the closer you get to 32 degrees, once you get over 32, you don't get frozen water, and so you don't get snow. And the coastal zone is already warmer than the others. Nevertheless, even 20% loss of the character of winter in the interior is really important for a lot of the things that we Mainers prize relative to the seasonality of our state and recreation and other aspects. Ocean temperature is warming. If you've been in Maine, you've probably heard that the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 99% of the world's oceans. The rate of warming has accelerated. We'll come back to that in a minute. It's definitely getting warmer, and it's having pretty profound impacts on our ecosystems and our fisheries, most notably the impacts on lobsters. We expect that to continue, potentially to continue to accelerate, depending on a number of factors. And then sea level rise is of high concern in a state that's got ballpark 3,500 miles of coast, not counting the islands. And sea level is rising along all of it, having a pretty big impact on coastal communities and coastal ecosystems. These are traces of the tide gauges along the Maine coast, the four major ones that we show there. Sea level's risen about 0.6 feet in the last century, with 0.5 to 2 feet. Probably more than that. Again, we'll look at that in a second. And lots of both focus and discussion about how we anticipate that sea level rise going forward. So, plenty of evidence for changing climate in Maine. The only thing that's not on that dashboard that will be in the future is ocean and coastal acidification, and that's because we haven't been monitoring it. It's a relatively new area in the climate change world of focus, or in the environmental world of focus. Whoop, it's getting away from me. And it has to do with ocean acidification, with carbon dioxide that we know is rising in the atmosphere, and that's the Mauna Loa atmospheric CO2. As it goes up in the atmosphere, it goes up in ocean, it dissolves in the ocean water. When you dissolve CO2 in water, it becomes acidic. And that's the pH is declining here, looking at that scale. These are stations out in the Pacific where there's not that long, but longer history of data. And now there's a lot of focus on measuring it in the Gulf of Maine. Coastal acidification is the same thing, plus pollutants that wash off of the landscape that have an additional impact in the nearshore zone. And so this is a concern in Maine. It's real, and we're experiencing it. We have less data there to report. This is a figure from the most recent Maine Climate Future Report 2020. And what it's showing is the amount of precipitation at one weather station in Farmington, Maine, that we focused on for this analysis. Each one of these bars is a decade bin, if you would, of the amount of precipitation going all the way back to 1900. And what you see is that the most recent bar is the tallest, because it represents that sharp increase in precipitation that we're seeing. Not only are we seeing more rain, over here, what it's showing is that we're getting significantly more of these larger events, 2 and 3 and 4 inch rain events, which are the most destructive of precipitation events. But it's not just that we're getting more of the big events, we're getting more of all of the events. And so down here, it's showing that of the total increased precipitation that we're seeing, about a third of it is from the small events. So we're getting more of the small events, more 2-inch events, plus some of the additional intense events. Our reports also try and point to various aspects of the effects. These are just some components of the changing winters that we're experiencing. These are over here data that show that for this region, from a larger study, we're seeing a decrease in ice, in frost, in snow, in snowmaking days, which obviously has an impact on recreation. And we're seeing an increase in the number of days of thaw, of bare ground, of mud season, and of insect survival, because a lot of the pests that are new were kept at bay by the cold winters and particularly cold lows, and those are warming. This map shows that essentially all of the lakes that are contained there have an earlier ice out. And this little table is showing you the number of days of earlier ice out that have been experienced since the beginning of roughly 1960. And so throughout the state, with few exceptions, we see earlier ice out, and that's that point when the ice is gone from our lakes, and we have many. All of those trends speak to the changes in the patterns over time. There's also a lot of spatial variability that we have in the climate system in Maine. These three colored zones that we saw on the snow map, and this is just showing the annual temperatures, are the three official climate divisions in the state of Maine: coastal, interior, and the northern. They are notably different. Those of us familiar with Maine and have traveled around it quite a bit in our lives know that, you see a big change. You get up in the morning down here and you drive up into the woods and you feel like you move through several climate zones, because you do. We have as much variation in the climate system across the state of Maine in 4 degrees of latitude, which is what this little map is showing. We cover 4 degrees of latitude here in Maine, as we see in Europe, on the European continent, from the Czech Republic all the way up to northern Scandinavia. So 4 degrees of latitude for us gives us as much variation in climate as we see in Europe across 20 degrees of latitude. So we have a lot of spatial variability in our climate, driven by, we have a mountain ridge running through the western part of the state, and we have, oops, it's going to drive me crazy. And we have the ocean along the coast, giving us sharp contrasts in relatively small spatial area. What about the future? We talked a little bit about it in the most recent report. These are projections that Sean Burkle did using IPCC, the CMIT 5 model means, which is a set of climate models used by the IPCC. And what he's showing here is that we have the black line is the temperature, basically the plot we've already seen. It's the air temperature in Maine over the past 100 years. And then these 3 colored lines are the projected climate changes going forward, and the shaded area around them is the variability in the prediction, based on these 3 scenarios. And these 3 scenarios are a code for representative concentration pathways. And these are IPCC scenarios, 2.6, 4.5, 8.5. It's not important what those numbers mean. 8.5 is basically the business as usual. There's some debate about that, and yet the most recent writings are saying, yeah, we're still really on this pathway. And so this was their worst case scenario in the modeling of potential futures, but it's also this pathway we're on right now until we do something about greenhouse gas emissions. In order to make dramatic changes, sharp reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, to get us down to here, we'd have to meet essentially the Paris Accord and then some. And then we would bend the curve on warming. And we know all about bending the curve now. That just simply means that we would flatten out. And the paragraph here describes the different endpoints for these trajectories. Business as usual could give us 10 degrees Fahrenheit annual mean increase in temperature by 2100 compared to a baseline if we do nothing, which so far is the path that we're on. However, point here is that the future trajectory that we go on is up to us and what we do relative to greenhouse gas emissions. This is the same kind of plot in a way for the warming in the Gulf of Maine. And this looks at a couple of different models. This is really similar to the 2.6 scenario we just looked at. And this is the business as usual scenario. This is the warming in the Gulf of Maine. You see this going up rapidly, and that's that 99% faster than the rest of the world as far as ocean water warming. If we do nothing, we're going to stay on this trajectory and continue to increase or accelerate. If we bend the curve sharply, then they're very similar until 2050. So almost no matter what we do between now and 2050, we're going to be approximately at the same point. But unless we start dramatically doing reductions in greenhouse gas emissions dramatically now, then when we hit 2050, we'll see very, very different futures. And so we're sort of loaded for a bit more of the unfurling bad news. But if we want to get off that trajectory, we need to immediately reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Otherwise, we'll keep going higher and higher in temperatures. And sea level rise is, as we've already talked about, quite important. We don't need to digest the technical details of this graphic having to do with potentially different scenarios. Up here is more the business as usual scenario. Down here is sort of unrealistically rapid reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And this, 3.9 feet sea level rise by the end of the century is the most probable expectation, depending on what we do relative to greenhouse gas emissions going forward. And this is the range around that. For the Maine Climate Council report, the Science and Technical Subcommittee took those data and came up with 2 recommendations. The legislation requested us to be very specific about this one particular indicator. And so our report says that we should commit in Maine to manage for sea level rise between 1.1 and 1.8 feet by 2050 and 3 to 4.6 feet by 2100. We've already seen, remember, about 2/3 of a foot rise to the present. And commit means that there's a high probability that that's the reality that we're going to experience. We should prepare to manage for roughly twice that level of sea level rise. And prepare implies that you should treat these levels as though they're almost unquestionable. But while you're doing that, you should also prepare and think through what you're going to do if, in fact, we go on to the much higher levels. And there's a real possibility that we do that. And a lot of that, again, depends on our actions relative to greenhouse gas emissions. Do these changes matter? Yes, and we're not going to get into it in detail here today, but a lot of the focus on doing these kinds of assessments has to do with providing the science to support adaptation and mitigation activities and planning. We can divide the world up into a lot of different ways. This is a slide I'll often use, and we could have a whole talk or a whole class on any one of these and more. But for all of these different sort of sectors of our lives and our economies, there's impacts of all of these changes in different ways at different levels. And what we do in these different sectors impacts the climate itself. And as you look at some of those images, and if we chatted about it a while, you probably all already come with pretty clear ideas about and experiences with the intersection of our changing climate and our daily lives. So yes, it matters that these changes are taking place across the board, but what do we do about it is really the key question. And what we do about it is use the best available science to develop strategies to address it. In June of 2019, Governor Mills, as we've already said, signed into law the Maine Climate Council, which now returned us to the table in Maine to develop a coordinated framework for this work throughout the state, for these activities throughout the state, and set us on a path for a set of very specific goals. Those goals include, now it won't change, there we go, to deliver an integrated climate action plan by December 1, so just a few weeks away. We've been working on it for a year. And the legislation she was signing in that picture set out targets for now, beyond 2020, 45% reduction in gross greenhouse gas emissions in the state below by 2030, below 1990 levels, and an 80% reduction below 1990 levels by 2050. In addition, she had gone down to the United Nations when she announced her executive order that Maine would be carbon neutral by 2045. And so these are very clear targets, very ambitious targets that will move us in the direction of bending the curve on those various plots that we looked at. The Maine Climate Council consists of 39 members as identified in the statute. And the council is responsible for developing this action plan and updating the action plan every 4 years. This is an ongoing entity of state government. There are also 6 working groups that support the work of the Maine Climate Council that have some 230 or more people that have been involved over the past year. Transportation, energy, natural working lands, coastal and marine, community resilience, public health, and emergency management. That one's a mouthful. Buildings, infrastructure, and housing. And all of them have developed strategies they've delivered back in June to the council, who's now deliberating and working on developing this initial climate action plan. In addition, there's a science and technical subcommittee that Catherine mentioned that it was charged with developing the best available science about our knowledge of climate change here in Maine and its linkages to all sorts of resources in the state. And as we saw in that other plot, oh, this is the timeline, forgot the slide. So basically we're here. The strategies were delivered in June of this past year. And the council is working on developing these strategies to deliver the action plan by December 1 to the governor and the legislature. And this report was just released last month. We released an earlier version of it back in January of this year, at the very beginning of the year, that we called a working document. Because we did it really fast, but it provided some basic information. And then over the spring and summer, we developed a more finished product that is this report. You can download these from the website for the Maine Climate Council. They're all as PDF. So let me finish up and stop fighting with my own slideshow. And just a couple closing thoughts. Climate change is accelerating in Maine, and so that's a really important point. These changes are taking place, and almost all of the indicators are going faster than they have in the past, and seem to be continuing to do so. And so we're not just falling behind, we're falling behind faster if we don't take action. Climate change is an unfolding crisis, but it's never the only factor. And so you can always point to the complex of activities or factors influencing some changes that we're seeing. Wow. We need to consider all of them, but climate change is in fact pretty much a part of everything in our modern world. What happens from away affects us here in Maine and vice versa. Obviously, what we do relative to emissions contributes to the global emissions. As climate change elsewhere, when they had a drought in the Midwest, our farmers suffered because of the price of grain. And obviously, when pests and pathogens start to migrate from away, they impact us here in Maine. I'm really sorry about this slide. Brings both risks and opportunity. The risks outweigh the opportunities, but there are opportunities for sure. Probably some of the exciting ones we see in renewable energy as we transition to a low carbon and zero carbon energy and transportation structure. There's whole new industries and sectors of the economy that are growing and will grow exponentially in the years ahead. Science-informed decision-making is not a net cost. Two pieces of this to emphasize: that we need to use the best science in order to make these decisions. I say science-informed instead of science-based because I never see policymakers really make decisions based just on science, because there's lots of other sort of political factors to consider. But science-informed, yes, and the very best policies that we see out there have been informed by science, and time again, particularly with air pollution, as Catherine mentioned, I've been involved in a lot of that, and with EPA and the Clean Air Act. Every time we look at investments in cleaning up the atmosphere, from acid rain to lead in fuels to mercury to ozone, and we evaluate what did it cost to do that and how much did American society benefit, the benefits always far outweigh the costs. And climate change is no different. And then finally, business as usual is not an option. In 2020, we're experiencing a host of challenges, from pandemic, social unrest, economic downturn, which doesn't change the fact that we still have the emerging climate crisis. They're all connected. We can't stand still. And so if we act in a mindful, science-informed, concerted manner, there's lots of reasons for optimism on how we can move forward. So with that, I'll stop there, as long as my slides stop there. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Ivan.
Sure.
I do have a couple questions. If you have a question, you can use the chat to type your question, and then I'll call your name out. I do see Reba. If you have a question, you can unmute yourself and ask it. Or you can type it in the chat.
Yes. Thanks so much, Ivan. Fascinating. I wonder if you could explain the difference between being carbon neutral and zero emissions. I'm looking at the Janet Mills's commitment to be carbon neutral by 2045, but by 2050 we'll just be at 80% reduction.
Right, great question. Thanks for asking that. I'm going to stop it from being in presentation mode so I can stop fighting with it. So that's a really important question. So thanks for asking it. The legislation says that Maine will be 45% and 80% lower as far as gross greenhouse gas emissions, and that's purposely stated that way to basically say no matter what else we do, we want to get off fossil fuels, and in order to get off fossil fuels, we've got to target the gross emissions. Doesn't matter if there's something else that's taking up carbon. Our mandate in Maine is to reduce the gross emissions that are in Maine primarily due to fossil fuels, and particularly a little over half is due to transportation. The difference between that and carbon neutral, or the net emissions, would be that you can take the greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels and you can offset them by something else. And a group that I was involved with did the exercise of a back of the envelope carbon cycle calculation for the state of Maine earlier this year, and you can download it from the FCCI, Forest Climate Change Initiative website at UMaine as a fact sheet. Bottom line, however, is our forests sequester or take up about 75% of what we emit here in Maine already. And so it won't take that much more for us to become carbon neutral. But that doesn't mean that at that point we wouldn't be burning all sorts of fossil fuels and spewing fossil carbon into the atmosphere, contributing to climate change. So carbon neutrality means the balance between how much we're emitting of anthropogenic, meaning human sourced greenhouse gases, compared to how much is being taken up by our activities. Now, we don't have big machines sitting in the state of Maine that take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but we have a lot of trees in the state of Maine. We're 89% forested. And so that's the offset. And so it's quite reasonable for us to get to carbon neutral and still be burning all sorts of fossil fuel. That's not what our charge is. Our charge is to get to carbon neutral and get off of the fossil fuel. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
We have another question from Vicky. She says, thank you. How does one state like Maine accomplish its goals without a concurrent and aggressive national strategy? And does the Climate Council take that question into consideration?
Great question. And, you know, it's a little bit the elephant in the room. I think the reality of climate change and the way we think about it here in Maine is that no matter who's occupying the White House and what's happening in Washington, climate change is still going on, and we need to do everything we can to address it, both from the standpoint of contributions to greenhouse gases, as well as what we do to build our own resilience, and so that we don't pay a higher price than we need to, because these changes are taking place. There are things also that we can do. You know, we spend, I forget what it is, $8 billion or something out of state for fossil fuels. Wouldn't it be wonderful to be investing that in ourselves and our energy systems and our economy? So there's lots of reasons for us to forge ahead. There's no question if we had leadership in Washington that moved us back to where we were a decade ago in moving towards a program for whatever, putting a price on carbon, investing in resiliency, coordinating among agencies, then all of these things will happen faster and more cost effectively than without that kind of leadership, which is what we've been experiencing. So yeah, it matters, but it doesn't change the sort of the importance of the tasks that I think we're engaged in. And there's some discussion within the council. It's not a political organization in that regard. So we don't sit around talking about that. It's really focusing on the technical aspects of what strategies we should implement here in Maine. Thanks for the question.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
You shared a lot of different graphics and data, and when we are at work on the Maine's climate future reports, we spend a lot of time on what data should we be presenting and how should they be presented. And you've now taken those reports, I think more so than I have, out into the world, and we certainly see them being cited and the figures used by others. But do you have a sense for either, like, what are the stories that are resonating the most with Maine people? All of those graphs represent a story about climate change in Maine, and I'm curious which ones seem to be the most popular or that resonate the most, or the stories that we hear people now retelling that we told in those reports.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't have many common forum to make this statement, but I've deeply appreciated my colleague Catherine during this process for well over a decade to do these reports, and so I think my answer is going to sound sort of cagey, but I think it changes over time. So when we did the 2009 report, we were in an era where there were still the issues of, you know, people were doubting. I mean, they still exist, but almost every, you know, audience, particularly with different communities in different parts of the state, would question the reality of climate change or humans' role in it, that type of thing. And so then there would be a lot of focus on the pattern of change over time and interannual variability of the temperature graph itself. I think between our first report and our 2015 update, we migrated to everyone really focusing on precipitation, particularly in the communities I deal with in agriculture and forestry, what have you. And then along coastal communities, of course, it's the warming temperature and sea level rise. You know, they were seeing sunny day flooding in their coastal community, and the fishing community was dealing with the changes in the fisheries. And so those different communities would sort of focus on, there's the data that speaks to what I think I'm seeing, and now I want to know more about it. And so I think we got to that phase. Now, at least in Maine, I think kind of across the board, there's the most interest is not so much in, you know, I think everyone likes to see the data that supports what they sort of know what's going on, but are particularly interested in the stories of how people are responding. What are they doing in communities? How's Belfast developing its climate plan? How do these farmers deal with these downpours and, you know, soil health programs? So I think there's a lot of second layers now of, yeah, that's the data, really important. We need to keep it updated. But now we're on to basically how we respond, and we want to hear how do we do that? What are the tools? So it changes over time, and I think it's been rewarding. I won't say fun, because the overall thing is not a good thing to be happening, but it's been really rewarding to see where the work that we've done in these reports fits in and informs those dialogues.
Thanks. We are approaching 1 o'clock, so I'm going to wrap it up. I did put that question in the chat because I'm curious for our participants' perspectives, what you're finding about stories and data that seem to resonate, or what people are asking for. And so feel free to message me. I'll put my email in there. And thank you all for joining us today. Certainly, Ivan, thank you.
You bet. Thank you.
I think this kind of institutional knowledge is really important when we think about environmental policy and history. So appreciate you continuing to document that and share it. And now it's for posterity, because we recorded this and we will be posting this. It'll take us a few days to get it up, but people can just go to the event page or Schoodic Institute's YouTube, and we have some other talks that have been going on recently are posted there as well. So thank you so much, Ivan.
You bet. Thank you.
Have a great day.
You too.